We're going to look briefly at clipping paths and discuss what they are and show you quickly how to create the clipping path and bring the item that you have created a clipping path around into Illustrator, and this will also work for InDesign. So you've been given the instructions in the tutorial materials last week and this week, and a few steps are outlined there for the clipping paths. It's not difficult to do, but it just, the fact is there are some steps that you have to follow, and not following one of those steps can make this not work. So you want to be sure to follow the steps accurately. But what a clipping path is essentially when you've used your pen tool and you've created a path around the object that you're isolating, the clipping path will allow you to place this image into a file without the background. So what we did in a previous tutorial was created the path, selected the item, copied and pasted it into another Photoshop image, and that's what we did here, or we dragged the layer and so on. We used the clipping path or the pen tool path to bring this aspect of our image into a larger image and do a merge of sorts. But what a clipping path will let us do is, with that path that we've created with the pen tool, we can actually just place this portion of the object in. I'll show you what I mean. So if I go to Illustrator, I'm just using a generic layout here. I just have a logo and a shape, and if I want to bring that puppy in and have him not have that white background like we'll see here, so here he is brought in, that image is placed in, and he has that white background. We want to do it so that he doesn't have that white background. So you can see we can't do any overlap, we can't put things behind him. We have to, of course, send this back and so on, but that doesn't help because now he's behind our shape. So one of the things that we do in Illustrator sometimes that can work in this regard is change the transparency mode. So I'll show you that. However, you're going to find that there's a catch to it, although it's helpful, and we have looked at it in the past with some work in InDesign. It is helpful, but you have to have the right situation to use it. So in this case, if I went to my transparency and I switched the mode on transparency to multiply, what this does is eliminate all of the light from this object, all of the white, or essentially anything that's creating lightness in the image. So we can see that eliminates the background, and on white or a very light color, it's helpful. Even here, if I wanted to bring it near the logo, you can see that it doesn't let the white show through. However, what it does is it lets whatever is behind this image show through. So when we put it over a color like that, we lose the true color of our image. So this is an ideal situation to use a clipping mask. And that clipping mask will isolate the object and allow it to be placed anywhere without the concern of show through or a background. So we'll look at how that's done now. So in Photoshop, you've worked with the pen tool, you've created your path. Remember, you have your paths panel, and that's where your path will reside. So you can double click on, if you haven't already, on work path, just to give it a name. You don't have to give it a formal name. You can just say okay. And what that does is it kind of locks the path in, it keeps it. You'll notice this one has way too many anchor points, and that's simply because this path was actually made from a selection. It wasn't made using the pen tool, it was made from a selection, and then that selection was converted into a path. So it's a little bit of a workaround just to allow this tutorial to be a little faster. So you have your path, and we want to designate this path as a clipping path. So we're not selected on that path right now on the paths panel. Now I am. So remember, anything you want to do, you have to designate to what you're working on. So I have to make sure that path is selected. And then I'm going to go to the flyout menu here, and I'm going to go down to clipping path. So I named the path, and I'm going to select clipping path. And it's going to ask me if I had multiple paths in the path panel, it would ask me which one. I only have one right now, so it's saying path 1. And then flatness, you can leave it blank, and I'll say OK. And you may have noticed that this kind of bolded. So that's indicating, just that bolding, it's not super clear, but it's indicating that this has been turned into a clipping path. Now, the other thing that is suggested, advised when you're using a clipping path is to crop down the excess of your image. So when I place this image in, even though only the puppy will show, technically it's bringing in the whole image, everything around him. So using the crop tool, this tool right here, and again, it's always helpful to watch the videos that they bring up with these tools. So using the crop tool, I'm just going to close this down, not touching him, but fairly close. And what that does is it just eliminates that excess file. And although it's not a lot in this case, this one, you're eliminating data, you're eliminating information or file weight, we'll say. So once you've cropped it close to the item, you can just click your check mark or press return. Okay, so we've cropped it down, and I'm just going to get my paths palette open again here. We have our clipping path made, and we've cropped this down. So now we're going to save this as a Photoshop EPS. Now, I've found that in recent versions of Photoshop, the clipping path actually takes now in file types that it didn't used to. But force of habit for me, and just feeling better knowing that it's going to work, is I always save out as a Photoshop EPS, but you can save as a TIFF, and I believe even the Photoshop file will place in if this is the only layer and you have that clipping path set. In fact, it doesn't even matter if it's the only layer as long as you have the clipping path set. In fact, let's see, I'm going to save this. I'm going to save it as a copy just so I'm sure I don't overwrite anything. So this is a PSD. So I'll go to Illustrator. I'm just going to make sure. Place PSD. I placed the wrong one there. There we go. Okay, so yeah, it works with the PSD. Now I'm going to show you a couple things here. When you bring it in, it's going to look a little rough. And when we zoom in, that because this is low res, there's a couple things going on here. This is low resolution. This was made from not from a correct pen tool selection. It was just a quick selection. So it looks a little rough. But the main thing that we want to notice is that it has this little white edge around it, meaning that it's picking up some of the background. So in order to avoid that, I'm going to go back to Photoshop. And when you get that, you can actually contract the selection. So if you created a clipping path, you're pulling an object from an image that has a background, but then when you place it into Illustrator, you see that Illustrator or InDesign, you see that it has some of that background. That's obviously something that you want to avoid. You don't want to have that extra clipping from anything beyond your object. So we can eliminate that. So I'm going to go back to my path and do the command click on the thumbnail to activate the selection. So remember, you command click on that thumbnail to activate whatever you have going on there. In this case, the path. I could have done it here as well because the puppy's on his own layer. So I could have command clicked on him there too. And then I'm just going to zoom in so we see what changes. So we can see he's going to have a little bit of that white background that came in, like we saw when we placed him into Illustrator. So I'm going to go to the Select menu and down to Modify and Contract. Now contract, it's a little deceiving because we can actually choose contract and then expand. So you can expand or contract from either. So we're going to go contract, and then we're going to, if I did -2, it would actually expand, and then expand if I did -2, it would contract. So whichever one you choose, you can actually do each, but we're going to contract, which means we're going to bring this in by 2 pixels, which should be plenty. It's not a lot in terms of pixels, but when you're just trying to get in and away from some of that excess, this will help. So 2 pixels, and we'll see what happens with the selection. So you can see it comes in a bit. So even 2 pixels is actually quite a bit. I'm going to do 1 pixel. So I'm going to go back, reset my selection. I can undo, or I can just command click here, and I'll expand or contract again. So select, modify, contract, and I'll do 1 pixel. Okay, there we go. So that's good. So now, this is where we saw that we can make a selection into a path. So I'm going to get rid of that path, and I'm going to go to my paths palette, make work path, and the tolerance is as low as it can be, 0.5 pixels. And there's that work path again, complicated because it's based on a selection, but that's fine in this case. And then again, we'll name the path. We'll go to the flyout menu, choose clipping path. Path 1, flatness can be blank, say OK, and then I'm going to save again. So that made that a clipping path. Now we'll place him in to Illustrator, so File and Place, and there he is. So that's better. Even though it's a very poor selection, again, a proper pen tool selection will be much cleaner on these edges. At least we don't have that excess white that came in. So clipping paths are great because you can have an image that has a background, and you can obviously pull some aspect of that image out without having to put it into another Photoshop image. If you just want to keep something clipped from the background, you could use the clipping path, and then you save as a Photoshop PSD or a Photoshop EPS. So when I was mentioning EPS earlier, what we used to have to do is go save as. We would save a copy, and then we would choose Photoshop EPS. However, over the last several versions, it seems they've made it so that it detects a clipping path and just adapts it almost regardless of what file type it is. But if you choose a JPEG, that won't work. PNG, of course, won't work. So Photoshop EPS or Photoshop document, and I believe a TIFF file would do it as well. Okay, so it's very helpful. Just let me know if you have any questions.